Welcome to the store. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me.
The world was on fire. Not in the literal sense, at least not yet, but metaphorically, civilization teetered on the brink of an inferno that no one would survive. President William Carter stood in the Oval Office, staring at the maps and reports scattered across the desk, each one more grim than the last. Famine, climate disasters, resource wars, it all pointed to the same inevitable conclusion: extinction. For decades, the warnings had come from scientists, activists, even political rivals. But humanity had ignored them, drowning in the arrogance that progress and technology would save them. Now, it was too late for that. No amount of diplomacy or global summits could reverse the damage done to Earth. The countdown to annihilation had begun. The hum of a monitor snapped Carter from his thoughts. On the screen, the Director of Temporal Affairs, Dr. Elizabeth Keller, waited with an urgent expression. "Mr. President," she said, her voice steady but strained, "we're ready." He nodded, though his stomach churned. Ready. He'd been hearing that word for months, and each time it brought him closer to the decision no leader should ever have to make. The Time Gate project had been in the works for years, buried deep in the shadows of classified budgets and secret laboratories. It was a marvel of human ingenuity, a time machine capable of sending a person back to a critical point in history. The goal: to rewrite humanity's self-destructive path before it was too late. But there was a catch. There was always a catch. The Time Gate could only be used once, and the traveler would be erased from existence, past, present, and future. Their life, their achievements, their memories in the minds of loved ones, gone. It was the ultimate sacrifice, and only one person could make the journey. Carter closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. He knew what had to be done. He'd known for months, ever since Keller had first briefed him on the project. Sending someone else would be a betrayal of everything he stood for. It had to be him. "I'll be there in an hour," Carter said, his voice betraying none of the turmoil within him. Keller nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation, and the screen went dark. Carter lingered in the quiet of the office for a few moments longer, his gaze drifting to the framed photos on the desk: his wife, Rebecca, their two daughters, Sarah and Emily. Would they remember him once he was gone? No, he reminded himself. They wouldn't. That was part of the deal. They'd live on in this new reality, unaware that he had ever existed. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Samuels, his chief of staff. "Sir, the car's waiting." Carter gave a curt nod. "Let's get this over with." The ride to the facility was silent. Samuels, usually a source of constant political chatter, was uncharacteristically quiet, likely processing the magnitude of what was about to happen. The black SUV glided through the city, passing towering skyscrapers, crumbling infrastructure, and streets filled with tension. Protests were a daily occurrence now, people demanding solutions that no longer existed. As they neared the Temporal Affairs building, a high-security compound hidden beneath a facade of government offices, Carter glanced at the familiar skyline one last time. This world, his world, was dying. But maybe, just maybe, he could give it a second chance. The facility's entrance was unremarkable, a simple steel door guarded by two soldiers. Inside, the air was cold, sterile. Scientists and technicians bustled about, their faces marked by the weight of history they were about to alter. Dr. Keller met Carter at the entrance to the Time Gate chamber, her hands clasped in front of her. She was a brilliant woman, with sharp blue eyes and an unwavering sense of duty. Carter had always admired that about her. "Mr. President," she said, "we've calibrated the machine to the target date. April 1962. You'll have roughly 1 year to make the necessary changes before the timeline locks into place. Carter nodded. The year had been chosen for a reason. It was a pivotal moment in human history, a time when the seeds of technological and political decisions would lead to future disasters. The Cold War was in full swing, nuclear arms races threatened global security, and unchecked industrial growth was laying the foundation for environmental collapse. 1 year, he repeated, as if saying it aloud would make it more manageable. Keller handed him a small device, no bigger than a wristwatch. This will help you navigate key points in the timeline. It contains historical data we've extracted, showing you the critical events that need to be altered. Remember, even the smallest change can have far-reaching consequences. Carter examined the device, feeling its weight in his palm. 1 man, 1 year, to change the fate of billions. He couldn't afford to fail, I understand. Keller hesitated, then added softly, "We'll never forget what you're doing for us." Carter smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You will, actually. That's the point." He turned toward the chamber door. It loomed ahead like a monolith, sleek and foreboding, with swirling energy pulsating within the archway. The Time Gate. A marvel of human achievement, and yet its very existence was a testament to their failure. If the world had heeded the warnings earlier, none of this would have been necessary. Rebecca, Sarah, Emily, the faces of his family flashed before his mind's eye, a final reminder of what he was giving up. He would never hold them again, never hear their voices, never see their smiles. But they would live. They would thrive in a world he had saved. Carter stepped through the gate. The sensation was indescribable. It wasn't pain, exactly, but a disorienting pull, as if his very essence was being unraveled and rewoven across the fabric of time. The world blurred, shifted, and then, stillness. Carter gasped, his body jolting as if waking from a dream. He stood on solid ground again, but it wasn't the world he had just left. The city skyline was different, cleaner, simpler. The streets bustled with life, but there was no tension, no sense of impending doom. He had made it, April 1962. He glanced at his reflection in a nearby window. The temporal process had altered his appearance slightly, enough to prevent recognition from any potential historical records. He looked younger, his hair darker, his face leaner. The lines of stress that had defined his presidency were gone. Good. It would make blending in easier. Carter's mission was clear. The device on his wrist flickered to life, displaying a list of key events he needed to influence. Each one a domino, leading to the eventual collapse of civilization. The first target, a private meeting between defense contractors that would lay the groundwork for a future arms race, spiraling out of control into nuclear proliferation. He had to stop it. Blending into the past was no easy feat, but Carter had spent months preparing for this. He had studied the cultural nuances, the political landscape, even the fashion. He purchased a simple suit, found a quiet apartment in the city, and began his infiltration into the corridors of power. The defense contractors were well guarded, their influence stretching across governments and industries, but Carter had an edge. He knew their future, knew exactly what decisions they would make and how to sway them. It was subtle at first, suggesting alternative paths, planting seeds of doubt about certain projects, pushing them toward more peaceful applications of their technologies. It worked, for a time, but altering the course of history was like navigating a minefield. Every step carried the risk of unintended consequences. One misstep, one wrong word, and the future could spiral into chaos in ways even he couldn't predict, and that's exactly what happened. It started small. Carter had successfully convinced a key defense contractor to slow the development of a prototype missile system that would later become central to the Cold War's arms race. But the company's shift in focus led to unexpected results. Instead of developing missiles, they diverted their resources into other military technologies, stealth aircraft, advanced radar systems, projects that seemed harmless at first but would later contribute to a different kind of arms escalation. He'd bought time, but not enough. The Cold War tension still simmered beneath the surface, and Carter knew that humanity's self-destructive tendencies were not so easily undone. Days turned into weeks as Carter maneuvered through history, carefully adjusting events and decisions, trying to minimize the fallout from each change. But each move felt like it was only delaying the inevitable. The timeline had a way of resisting, pushing back in subtle but unyielding ways. New conflicts emerged in place of the old ones. New figures rose to power, determined to continue the march toward war and environmental collapse. The pressure weighed on him more than he'd anticipated. He began to question his every decision, second-guessing his judgment. Was he truly making things better? Or was he simply rearranging deck chairs on a sinking ship? The weight of the world, literally, pressed down on his shoulders, and the isolation of his mission only deepened that burden. No one knew what he was doing, no one could remember who he was or what he was sacrificing. He was a ghost in the timeline, invisible and alone. One evening, as he sat in his apartment poring over historical documents and planning his next move, a knock at the door startled him. He wasn't expecting visitors. Carefully, he slid a pistol from a drawer, a relic of his former life as president, and approached the door with caution. "Who is it?" he called out. A voice responded, hesitant but firm. "Dr. Jonathan Weissman. I think you might need my help." Carter's heart skipped a beat. Weissman wasn't supposed to exist. He was a historian and physicist from the original timeline, but in this new version of reality, he should have had no knowledge of the future, no awareness of time travel, no understanding of the changes being made. But here he was, standing on Carter's doorstep, fully aware that something was wrong. Carter opened the door, keeping his gun hidden but ready. "How did you find me?" Weissman, a man in his mid-30s with sharp eyes and a thin build, stepped inside cautiously. "I noticed some anomalies in the timeline. Historical records, patterns that didn't fit. At first, I thought I was losing my mind, but the more I researched, the more I realized something was being altered. Something big." Carter stared at him, unsure whether to be relieved or terrified. "What do you know?" "Enough to know that you're not from here," Weissman said, his voice low. "You don't belong in this time, do you?" Carter exhaled slowly, holstering his gun. There was no point in denying it now. "No, I don't. But that's not important. What matters is that I'm trying to stop something worse from happening." Weissman nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I figured as much. But the problem is, you're not stopping it." "Not really." Carter clenched his fists, frustration boiling beneath the surface. "You think I don't know that? Every time I change something, something else goes wrong. It's like the timeline is fighting back." "That's because it is," Weissman said, his voice calm but resolute. "Time has a way of correcting itself. You can nudge it, bend it, but it doesn't like to be broken. It resists. Then what's the point?" Carter muttered, feeling the weight of his failures crushing him. "Why even bother if I can't change anything?" Weissman studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You're trying to change events, but maybe what needs to change isn't the events themselves. Maybe it's the people. Carter frowned, unsure what he meant. The people? History is shaped by individuals, by their choices, their beliefs, Weissman explained. You've been focused on altering decisions, but the real key might be altering the people making those decisions. It was a concept Carter hadn't considered. He'd spent so much time trying to manipulate events, to pull the strings from behind the scenes, that he hadn't thought about changing the very fabric of the decision-makers themselves. Could he influence not just their choices, but their entire outlook on the future? How do I do that? Carter asked, a sliver of hope igniting within him. Weissman smiled faintly. That's the challenge, isn't it? You're running out of time, but there are still key players who can shape the future in ways you haven't considered. People who, if you reach them, could set humanity on a different path. Carter didn't waste any more time. Armed with Weissman's insight, he shifted his approach. He began targeting influential figures, not just for their decisions but for their ideologies. He met with politicians, scientists, activists, anyone who had the power to influence the course of history. Instead of altering singular events, he started changing minds, planting seeds of hope, innovation, and cooperation. He found himself in rooms with people who would go on to become major players in the technological and geopolitical spheres of the future. He didn't try to steer them with fear or threats of impending doom. Instead, he painted a picture of what the world could be, a future where humanity thrived, where innovation served the greater good, where cooperation outweighed conflict. It wasn't easy. Some resisted, others mocked his idealism. But slowly, the tide began to turn. Carter saw glimpses of the future he was trying to create, a world not saved by a single act, but by 1,000 small changes, each one rippling outward. As the year drew to a close, the timeline began to settle. Carter could feel it in the air, a kind of stillness that told him his work was done. He had altered enough minds, enough decisions, to set humanity on a new course. The future wouldn't be perfect, it never was, but it would be better. It would be survivable, but the final cost was yet to be paid. Carter stood on a hill overlooking the city, the sun setting in the distance. This world, this timeline, was different now. His mission had succeeded. But in doing so, his existence would be erased. Soon, the world would forget that William Carter had ever been president, that he had ever made this sacrifice. His family, his friends, even Weissman, they would live on in this new reality, unaware that he had been the one to make it possible. He took a deep breath, the last one he would take as himself. The device on his wrist blinked, signaling the end. The timeline was locking into place, and with it, his presence would fade. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to remember Rebecca's laugh, the way Sarah and Emily ran toward him when he came home after long days. He remembered the weight of his daughter in his arms, the warmth of his wife's embrace. But those memories, like everything else, would be lost, and then, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, he was gone. The world moved on.